Tang Dynasty dates 618 to 907 CE, is considered the pinnacle of Chinese civilization. Its capital, Chang'an, whose name means perpetual peace, embodied all that was great about the glorious Tang era. Rising at the eastern terminus of what we now know as the Silk Road, in modern-day Shanxi province, Chang'an's elegant symmetry and epic architecture inspired imperial cities across Asia, including Seoul, Kyoto, Nara, and Hue. It was by far the greatest city on earth. Shortly before our story begins, the short-lived Sui dynasty from 581 to 618. Well, it was toppled by one of its generals, Li Yuan. The general declared a new dynasty, the Tang, which would last for the next 300 years. Under Li Yuan and his brilliant, often ruthless son, Li Shimin, the Tang rapidly consolidated an empire that stretched from the oases of Central Asia to the East China Sea, and from the steppes of modern Mongolia to the borders of present-day Vietnam. Work on a new imperial capital had actually begun during the Sui dynasty, but Chang'an really came into its own during the Tang. It dwarfed all imperial cities that had risen before it. It measured 6 miles by 5 miles and housed a population of more than 1 million people within its walls that were 18 feet high, made of rammed earth and faced with masonry. A headman who was responsible to city officials for all the good and ill conduct of his charges governed each of the city's 110 wards, 110 headmen. And the imperial constabulary, known as the Golden Bird Guard, enforced the curfew, monitored the city's traffic, and apprehended delinquents. More than a dozen great wooden gates opened inward onto crisscrossing boulevards and outward to the suburbs and the agricultural districts outside the city. These gates controlled the entry and exit of residents, opening at dawn and closing at dusk as dictated by a strict curfew. And the gates of each city ward followed a similar schedule. Today we'll visit Chang'an during the reign of Xuanzong, reign 712 to 756 CE. Xuanzong's reign is widely considered the golden age of the Tang Golden Age, the golden age of this great city. Chang'an itself was arranged on a north-south axis, like all Chinese imperial capitals, with the imperial palaces and the administration buildings occupying the northern half and facing south. A grand boulevard that was 492 feet wide ran the 2.5 miles due north from the great central gate in the southern wall to the entrance to the palace district. Another 10 tree-lined avenues ran parallel to that thoroughfare, with 14 more running east to west. The city was designed to exude power and order, to overawe visitors and residents alike. We'll come to the residential areas of the city in a little bit, but one look at the map shows us that Chang'an was first and foremost a seat of government. It was dominated by imperial palaces and the offices of the 6 ministries. That's the Ministry of Personnel, the Ministry of Rights, the Ministry of Public Works, the Ministry of Revenue, the Ministry of Punishments, and the Ministry of the Armed Forces. Some of these official buildings were truly immense. There was also housing for visiting provincial officials. There were military training grounds, imperial academies, and huge libraries. To give you a sense of the size and grandeur of the Tang capital, there was an imperial park just beyond the northern wall. That park enclosed the area that had once been the entirety of the capital of the Han Dynasty. Chang'an's official buildings were rivaled by its religious architecture. The city was home to countless Buddhist and Taoist temples, as well as Zoroastrian and Nestorian churches. One Taoist abbey had a library of more than 50,000 scrolls. But it was the Buddhist temples that were particularly impressive. One covered an entire city ward. Another had a main hall that was 160 feet tall. and housed an immense carved Buddha. The only Tang-era structures still standing in modern Xi'an are part of Buddhist temples. These are the two wild goose pagodas. Tang society was rigidly hierarchical, with laws dictating the dress, the housing, and the transportation that could be used by each stratum of that society. At the top of the social pyramid was the Imperial clan, followed closely by the aristocratic lineages that dominated the top rungs of the bureaucracy and the military. Each of the Tang's aristocratic clans, these huge families, were periodically ranked in great registers. In addition to the aristocrats who held the privileged positions, the daily operations of the government were handled by countless functionaries and scribes. The Taoist and Buddhist clergies were a social class unto themselves. Most of them were poor, but some were fabulously wealthy and powerful. Out in the rest of the city was a vast sea of commoners, peasants and laborers, artisans, merchants and slaves. Tang China was also home to tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of foreigners. In Chang'an, they tended to be segregated and organized in their own wards under their own self-governing headman system. The Tang was very cosmopolitan, and that cultural openness had a lot to do with the mixed ancestry of the Tang Imperial clan, which combined Chinese blood with that of Turkic warriors who had come to dominate much of China during the 4 centuries of political fragmentation that had preceded the Sui-Tang reunification. One son of Emperor Taizong was so enamored of his Turkic heritage that he took to living in a ger, a round felt tent on the palace grounds. He hunted wild game and pastured his herds in the park-like setting. In one sense, the Tang had to be cosmopolitan. The empire included parts of what is now northern Korea, Manchuria, stretches of Mongolia, and much of what is now Vietnam. Tang emperors felt free to patronize foreign religions like Buddhism and also Chinese Taoism. They had in their retinues Chinese scholars, along with Sagdi and Korean generals. In fact, the ruling Li family claimed descent from Lao Tzu, the Taoist sage, and at the same time claimed that the emperor himself was an incarnation of the future Buddha, known as the Maitreya. Those are impressive pedigrees. The prestige and legitimacy of a dynasty could also be measured by its gravitational pull on the wider world. The more foreign merchants, missionaries, musicians, and military men, the more foreign goods and exotica that were drawn into the Tang orbit, the greater the dynasty looked to audiences, both foreign and domestic. Much of the great art of the era was dedicated to portraying emperors receiving gifts and emissaries from the far corners of the known world. And much of the ink that was spilt on Tang prose and poetry sang the praises of the exotica, the wild animals that made it to the mansions and markets of Chang'an. Nor was Chang'an the only cosmopolitan city in Tang China. There was also the great emporia of Luoyang, the eastern capital, and Yangzhou on the Grand Canal. And then there was Guangzhou, a chaotic, tumble-down mess of a metropolis on the southeast coast. You probably know it as Canton. In the Tang, it was home to more than 200,000 people. Canton was a great maritime hub populated by Chinese, Malays, Arabs, Indians, Chams, Khmers, Sinhalese, Javanese, Persians, Koreans, Japanese, and Annamites. Its bustling markets traded silks, porcelain, slaves for spices, ivory, camphor, and sandalwood, rhinoceros horn, kingfisher feathers, and opium. Whereas Canton was chaotic, Chang'an was carefully planned and laid out like a house, with the private quarters, those imperial palaces, to the back, to the north of the city. And the public areas where business gets done in front of those. And then the common areas occupying the southern districts of the city. In this way, Chang'an was more like two cities in one. The imperial city of officialdom, fronted by a noisy, bustling city of the common folk. Imperial palaces, precursors to Beijing's Forbidden City, sit to the north, inside the city wall. Behind them, outside the wall, as in Beijing still today, are the great parks where the imperial clan would spend their leisure time. To the east of the emperor's residence was the equally grand home of the empire's second most important person, the heir apparent. Directly south of the main palaces, we find the administrative city, home to those government offices I talked about. There you'd find also the emperor's ancestral temple and, most crucially, the altars of soil and grain. This was where the emperor acted as intermediary with the divine, making sacrifices to heaven on behalf of his subjects. These altars were the empire's spiritual epicenter. Just in front of the official districts was Chang'an's most magnificent boulevard, the Hengjie, which was almost 700 feet wide and ran west to east for 6 miles. It divided the city in two. Most of Chang'an's elite, including the aristocratic lineages and senior government officials, preferred to site their mansions in the more fashionable wards, on the east and northeast side of the city, near the palace of the heir apparent. Given the Tang obsession with status, it's easy to imagine why the aristocracy outdid itself in building grand mansions in this part of town. The western side of the city was more crowded, more chaotic, and home to a less savory crowd. It also included the city's large foreign population. Between the mansions of the aristocracy and offices of the bureaucracy and military was one area known as the North Hamlet. It was Chang'an's high-rent pleasure district, where female and male companionship could be had for the right price. Here, the exotic was very much in vogue. Green and blue-eyed courtesans fetched a premium, especially if they entertained their guests with exotic dances and songs and plied them with fine wines like a dry Shiraz from Persia or rare fruits from the oases of Central Asia. The further one moves away from the tony areas of Chang'an, the grittier things got. The lower you would move down the social ladder. For example, the houses of government functionaries were generally in the districts closest to the ministries, while the wards along the south walls of the city were home to commoners and to petty merchants. The eastern market of Chang'an was less rowdy than its western counterpart, which we'll come back to, but otherwise it was a mirror image. But class distinctions weren't always that cut and dry. Along the southeast side of the city, dozens of inns and taverns catered to the elite and to commoners alike. Tang officials and aristocrats were not above slumming it for some distraction and diversion. The exception on the southeast side of Chang'an was the Serpentine River Park, which was off limits to most commoners. Here, aristocrats and successful examination candidates threw parties in its pavilions and celebrated their academic successes with many cups of ale while boating on the man-made lake. And there was one thing that seemed to unify all the social strata of Chang'an. That was soccer, or at least an ancient Chinese variant of soccer, where teams used their feet to propel a feather-filled leather ball through a narrow goal. Emperors, aristocrats, soldiers, and commoners alike were obsessed with playing and watching tsuju. Returning to the mansions and pleasure quarters of Chang'an's elite on the city's Upper East Side, amid all this conspicuous consumption and pleasure was the Eastern Market. The Eastern Market, as I mentioned earlier, was enormous and was matched on the west side of the city by a mirror image, the Western Market. But the Eastern Market, like the Western, was about 466 acres, divided into 9 sectors like a tic-tac-toe board, 4 avenues crisscrossing it. Within those 9 sectors, there were some 220 lanes or hangs, each one dedicated to a category of goods and services, such as the leather goods hang, the gold and silver hang, the apothecary hangs, and the like. In the Eastern market, we see the tradition of locating categories of shops all in one area to facilitate their regulation. If you visit older parts of Tokyo or Beijing today, you can still see this with all the greengrocers or hardware stores lined up in one neighborhood and all the furniture shops clustered in another. The government set limits on prices and established standards for weights and measures, as well as for the quality of goods. At the center of each of the city's two big markets was a tower that housed the market commandant's offices. Sounds very military, right? The commandant has staff and had all the regulating equipment, all the weights and measures there. They were there to test the weights and measures, to prevent price fixing, speculation, and counterfeiting. The commandant's tower was topped by bells that rang to open and close the markets and mark the hours of the trading day. The tower also doubled as an imperial granary whose contents could be released in times of famine. Given its proximity to the posher neighborhoods of Chang'an, the goods at the Eastern market were generally more expensive and of finer quality than over at the otherwise identical Western market. In the Eastern market, that's where you'd find luxurious silks, fine wines, exquisitely made musical instruments, along with the pick of the field, the stream, and the forest. The Eastern market was strategically located for the sale of luxury goods imported by sea and transported up the Grand Canal to that side of Chang'an. These included fresh fish and shellfish from the coasts and exquisite cabinetry and bronze mirrors from the Grand Canal city of Yangzhou. Bronze mirrors were much in demand in Chang'an. It was a very fashionable place. Aristocratic women and high-class courtesans kept themselves in the latest fashions of dress, hairstyle, and makeup. Men, too, particularly aristocrats and powerful officials, had to take care to look their best in public, and especially in an audience with the emperor. And even rarer and more valuable items were occasionally for sale in Chang'an's markets. On one occasion, a Buddhist monk was invited to a banquet at the home of the wealthy chief minister, Li Linfu. Li presented the monk with a small golden box. Inside the box was something that looked to the monk like a rusty nail. The monk took the present to the Eastern market, where an expert appraiser identified it as none other than a finger bone of the Buddha, a treasure worth 1,000,000 copper cash. The monk promptly sold the relic to help the needy. You're probably familiar with the traditional copper cash, that round copper coin with the square hole through the middle. Copper cash was your walking around money, but you couldn't and wouldn't want to walk around Chang'an with 1,000 strings of 1,000 coins each. That's 1,000,000 copper cash, while you were shopping for the Buddha's finger bone. You did have a couple of options. You could pay in gold, or you could pay in silver, or you could pay in silk. Silk was the commodity of choice for big ticket purchases in the Tang. Silk's valuable, durable, and it's a lot lighter than silver or gold. When you paid your taxes, a portion was assessed in silk. And if you were lucky enough to be an official, part of your salary was payable in bolts of the fabric. So this Tang government had a big stake in keeping the quality of silk high. It was a hedge on inflation. If you had to move a lot of money to purchase a mansion or buy out the contract of an elegant courtesan, you could go to the gold and silver hang, where you'd deposit your bullion and they'd write you out a promissory note against those deposits. Private and official credit instruments could be redeemed even outside the capital in the empire's larger cities. You might need one of those notes to buy something truly exciting, like a golden peach from the oasis of Samarkand. The ruler of Samarkand in modern Uzbekistan had sent the Tang emperor a gift of fancy yellow peaches, which were said to be as large as goose eggs and and in a color like gold. The story of these peaches took the capital by storm. Did they taste like the peaches eaten by the Taoist immortals? Would eating one make me immortal? Speculation ran riot. Here was something truly exotic and meant solely for the emperor's table. And so, if a few of these peaches did make it out of the palace and into the hands of a grocer in the Eastern market, you'd have to weigh the risks. Tang China had strict sumptuary laws governing what the various classes were allowed to wear and to eat. Even if you could afford a black market golden peach from Samarkand, you might be courting the death penalty. And executions took place across town at the public execution grounds of the decidedly grittier and far more pedestrian Western market. Let's check it out. As I said, the Western market had the exact same layout as the Eastern market. It was, however, distinct in that it was fed by a canal that imported bulk commodities like timber, salt, and charcoal. Beside bulk goods, the Western market specialized in items of a generally lower price and quality. Whereas the Eastern market had the polychrome silks that adorned the wealthy, the textiles in the Western market were the coarse white hemp tunics and trousers worn by commoners. It was more pedestrian in other ways as well, such as its cheap snacks, ales, and inexpensive wines made with local grapes rather than those imported vintages from Persia and Armenia. Its moneylenders were more akin to loan sharks than the gold merchants of the Eastern market, with their sophisticated credit instruments. You wouldn't find those in the Western market. The entertainment on offer, be it street performers or acrobats, prostitutes, well, those were definitely on the lower end of the market. There were loads of beggars and panhandlers who roamed the streets and frequented the soup kitchens and poorhouses sponsored by Buddhist clergy. There was one Buddhist charity that had a particularly ingenious fundraising scheme. For a few copper cash, you could buy a live fish and then release it into a pond. That way you'd reap all that good karma. Then after the market closed, the monks would scoop up all the fish and sell them anew the next day. It was a little rough, but the Western market had its charms. It had a decidedly exotic flair. You were guaranteed to run across some Persians and Sogdians. Persian was the language of the sea trade, which followed the monsoon, sailing southwest from China on the winter monsoon and northeast from the Indian Ocean in spring. Sogdian was the language of the caravan routes of Central Asia. Caravans that relied on the indomitable Bactrian camel. You'd see a lot of those camels in the Western market. And the Western market was one of the most exciting places in Chang'an. There were lots of entertainers, singers, jugglers, sword swallowers, and storytellers. A particularly popular form of storytelling was Buddhist salvation tales. These were often rendered as plays, but they also came in a much more mobile, compact form. This is the picture scroll. We have one from the oasis city of Dunhuang that relates the tale of Mulian. Mulian has to rescue his mother from the underworld. On one side of the scroll is the written story. On the reverse is the graphic element, a painting of Mulian's journey through various Buddhist hells with their demons and suffering sinners. As the storyteller reads, he unwinds the scroll, gradually revealing more of Mulian's quest. It's a morality tale about a filial son who saves his less than perfect mother, and it's chock full of lurid detail. Equally lurid were the public executions carried out under a solitary willow tree in the middle of the Western market. These gruesome spectacles drew huge crowds. They might involve a reading of the charges. It might be a chance for you, a commoner, to see a member of the aristocracy brought low by venality and corruption. The two main forms of capital punishment were strangulation and decapitation. Strangulation was slower and more painful, but viewed as less punitive because It kept the body intact. Decapitation was reserved for the most heinous crimes, like murder and sedition. Corpses and heads were left on display as a warning. In the Western market, we see the Tang legal system on display. And we can get a sense of the dynasty's obsession with order and symmetry in the market's formal grid. But the Western market was also a hotbed of illegality and disorder, notorious for its gangs of lawless young men. It also attracted knights errant, a strange group of noble vigilantes to whom one might plead to right a wrong that had fallen through the cracks of the Tang justice system. The great Tang poet Li Bai fancied himself one of these knights errant. Even more notorious were the Western market's paid assassins, the butchers. These men were literally butchers by day who moonlighted killing their fellow man. But why butchers? Well, one thing is facility with the blade. And while medieval Chinese loved their meat, they reviled the men who butchered it. From a Buddhist perspective, a butcher's karma was virtually irredeemable. They had nothing to lose. They couldn't sink any lower. After killing so many animals, killing a few people wouldn't change your fate, would it? So as much as the Tang founders wanted Chang'an to be a model of order and imperial power, its own markets exposed the limits of that order. The golden age of the Tang and the golden age of Chang'an came to an end in 755 when General An Lushan rose in revolt and marched on the great city. Decades of civil war followed, during which Chang'an was sacked and burned repeatedly. It was frequently rebuilt, though on an ever-diminishing scale. In the year 906, the warlord who controlled what was by then a pathetically weak Tang central government ordered what was left of Chang'an's wooden palaces and government buildings to be dismantled and shipped to Luoyang in the east. Chang'an never fully recovered. It was rebuilt during the Ming Dynasty, and Xi'an today serves as the capital of Shanxi province. It's well worth a visit. The Terracotta Army is nearby, as is the early Bronze Age site of Banpo. The wild goose pagodas are still there, as are relics of the Buddha, although they're not for sale, and if someone tells you they are, they're probably not real. Xi'an's old city wall is also partly intact. Seeing a city wall like that will give you a really rare glimpse into what an Imperial-era city looked like. But even Xi'an's Ming Dynasty wall encompasses an area less than half the size once enclosed by the Tang city wall. And it wasn't just war that spelled the decline of this great metropolis. And this is a tale that we ignore at our peril. By the end of the 8th century, just past the peak of the Golden Age, Chang'an was already doomed. Not doomed in some catastrophic sense, like, say, Pompeii. Chang'an's doom was more a disaster in slow motion. A city of the size, the scale, the consumptive profile of medieval Chang'an was unsustainable for its time and place. An insatiable appetite for timber and fuel had denuded the once richly forested hillsides of the region around Chang'an, a region that had been a seat of Chinese political power for more than 12 centuries. By the 900s, the region's wildlife was decimated. Intensive farming had exhausted the soil, and the water table was in full retreat. Wind and rain did the rest. By then, the only way to feed the city was with imports from the east. But erosion upstream and flooding downstream clogged the western reaches of the Grand Canal that had supplied Chang'an. Feeding Chang'an's millions over the centuries and building and rebuilding its impressive urban architecture proved to be the city's undoing.